ballot their vote. And so that's really the key question. I'm not sure we have a good answer yet. Sorry, Dan, we appreciate your analysis. Thank you. Up next.
You're doing YouTube wrong. I know that sounds super hard, and I hate to break it to you, but I'm about to save you a whole bunch of time.
Eve, maybe you could begin to let it out. No, this isn't over yet, but the votes are being counted. Not as fast as we want, but democracy is working. We're proving once again that it is our voices that count.
White sandy beaches, crystal blue water. How incredible is that? We only get one shot at making the first impression. We're here to work, or you will be gone. High maintenance charter guest. This crew needs to step it up. New crew, perfect storm. This is not over. Get back to this boat now. Suck it up, cream puff.
Set your DVR to watch new episodes of Problems Below Deck every Monday after 9.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Breaking news in our changing world. Download the NBC News app.
I didn't know, was my child dead? Was my child passed?
I just kept saying, please be okay, please be okay. You rush your child to the hospital.
A woman came in, normal clothes. We get down the hallway. She closes the door. They were accusing me of child abuse.
And that's when the real nightmare begins. Calm down.
No, it's my children. I can't calm down.
Do no harm. A new podcast series from NBC News and Wondery. First 2 episodes available Tuesday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcast.
I wore my snowshoes.
Hashtag blessed on that one.
I am a purebred Mormon. I'm Pentecostal. It is a very big deal that I'm no longer Mormon. I was raised Mormon, but I'm converting to Islam. Assalamu alaikum, bitches. Perfection is attainable. She's a bitch. Go away.
Amen. The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City premieres Wednesday at 10, only on Bravo. Set your DVR.
President Trump is fighting hard in court to delegitimize the election results, but there have been no reports of widespread voter fraud. So why does he continue to fight? How long will this continue for? NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray joins us now. Where do you see Trumpism and the Republican Party going from here?
Well, in the immediate term, Lindsay, you end up having 2 runoffs in Georgia that are going to be taking place in January 5th for control of the Senate. And the Republicans actually see that Trumpism versus Mitt Romneyism or Paul Ryanism or even John McCainism has been more successful for them, getting out voters that they hadn't been able to get out in the past. And so I think that if you look just through the lens of these runoffs in Georgia, the Republicans feel like President Trump, outgoing President Trump, is the key to their political survival. But these things aren't permanent, and coalitions often do end up changing. And what is good in the short term might not necessarily be good in the long term.
And we know that by law, the current president doesn't have to concede for the next administration to take over. But why are concession speeches so important?
You know, Mark Salter, who's a chief speechwriter and aide to John McCain, spoke to our colleague Andrea Mitchell about this yesterday. And he was mentioning it. One, it's good for the candidate just to be able to move on. Two, it's good for the country to be able to kind of say, the democracy is working, you can have change of power. And three, it's actually good for that political party to basically also to move on. So concessions are probably good for the soul. It's good to actually be a good loser. And we'll have to wait and see whether the president gets to that point in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, we certainly will. And soon we will hear from President-elect Biden about the Affordable Care Act, which is being argued in front of the Supreme Court today. So what kind of case do you think he'll make, and why do you think he is making this address?
I expect him to say what he said throughout the entire 2020 presidential campaign, including at the debates, and that is it's important to expand on the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. The Republicans have tried again and again to dismantle it, and that he thinks that during a pandemic, it's important to actually strengthen choices and insurance options for Americans rather than take them away. So I think that he'll stick to that script in his remarks later today.
Mark Murray, good to see you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay.
And regardless of who you voted for, it should be mentioned that the Biden administration is making history with Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. She'll be the first woman in that role, the first person of color in that role. She's a former prosecutor, state attorney general, her stepmother and wife, and now she adds vice president-elect to her long list of titles. Here's NBC's Chanel Jones with more on her remarkable journey.
While I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last. History in the making. Kamala Harris has shattered one of the last glass ceilings in America. No stranger to trailblazing, this vice president-elect is also a lady of firsts, the daughter of an East Indian mother and Jamaican father. As a kid, she was bused across town when her school began to integrate. After attending Howard University and then earning a law degree, Harris became a prosecutor and district attorney, she says, on a mission to help change the system.
To discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter. Congratulations, Attorney General.
She later broke barriers as California's first Black and first female Attorney General.
Our new U.S. Senator, Kamala Harris! Woo!
In 2016, Harris smashed another barrier, becoming the first Black woman to win a California Senate seat and just the second ever elected to the Senate.
Has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone?
I wouldn't.
Yes or no?
In Washington, Harris made her mark by asking the tough questions that rattled her adversaries and quickly went viral.
I'm running for president because I love my country.
And last year, Harris became one of the few Black women ever to run for president. After an unsuccessful bid, she pivoted, joining the Biden campaign with the promise of the country's second highest office.
The answer is absolutely yes, Joe, and I am ready to work. I am ready to do this with you, for you.
And with that, Kamala Harris stepped up as the first woman of color on a major party ticket.
The road ahead will not be easy, but America is ready.
As vice president, what role will she play and how will she influence this administration? New Jersey Senator Cory Booker had this to say of his good friend and colleague.
She has an ability to stand her ground, and anybody who knows her she knows she does that, standing up for what she believes in and who she's fighting for. But she actually has a way of also finding common ground.
If her Senate record is any indication, Harris will most likely continue her work on police and criminal justice reform, protections for immigrants, and her campaign promise to end the filibuster and focus on climate change.
She's is going to get a lot more questioning because of being a woman, and I think she is more than ready to handle it.
I feel extremely proud to be an American, to be able to be here, to bear witness to this. This is a huge day. A lot of dreams realized.
As Kamala Harris prepares to take her oath as our nation's number 2, she follows in the footsteps of the 48 vice presidents who came before her, all of them white, all of them men. Her nomination redefines who gets to lead our.
I want to be able to do the same thing she's doing. Kamala Harris is a very much inspiration to me.
Hey everyone, I'm Allison Morris. You're watching NBC News Now. We begin today with a showdown over Obamacare. The Supreme Court hearing a case today that could determine what happens to the Affordable Care Act and healthcare for 20 million Americans. Meanwhile, the U.S. is shattering coronavirus records, reporting more than 133,000 new confirmed cases on Monday, topping 130,000 cases for the first time. More than 240,000 Americans have now died from the virus. The Affordable Care Act is the signature legislative achievement of the Obama-Biden administration. Today, President-elect Joe Biden warned against overturning it.
Let's be absolutely clear about what's at stake. The consequences of the Trump administration's argument are not academic or an abstraction. For many Americans, they are a matter of life and death in a literal sense.
With Obamacare in the Supreme Court, President Trump has been holed up in the White House, making no public appearances and refusing to concede the election. The races in Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina still too close to call. We'll have more on that a little later in the hour. But first, let's go to NBC News correspondent Mike Memoli. He has the very latest on the Biden transition from Wilmington, Delaware. And NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams is in Washington, D.C. with the latest on the Supreme Court hearing. Tell us about those oral arguments today.
Well, I'd say Joe Biden doesn't have anything to worry about because it did appear that a majority of the Supreme Court is not willing to strike Obamacare down. There are really three questions. Do the 18 red states who filed this lawsuit have the standing to bring it? Could they show concrete injury? I'm not sure what the court's going to say about that. Their second argument is that the individual mandate is unconstitutional. You recall that when Obamacare was first passed, the individual mandate said you had to buy insurance or pay a penalty on your tax. The Supreme Court said that was a legitimate use of Congress's taxing authority. And then the Republican-controlled Congress in 2017 said, we'll just set the tax at zero. Then you can no longer say the tax saves the law, so it's unconstitutional. And then they said, because of that, the rest of the law has to fall. There are at least 5 votes on the court, it does seem apparent from today's argument, perhaps more, who are not willing to say that the entire law must fall. Chief Justice John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh both said, we base our decision on whether you have to strike down an entire law if part of it is invalid based on what we think Congress would want us to do. And in 2017, when they zeroed out the tax, they did not strike the whole thing down. They did not say the whole thing should be struck down if the tax was invalidated. So it does appear there are at least 5 votes to spare it. That's really the end of the story, but there may be more than that. I don't know what the court's going to do on the individual mandate, but that's a dead letter now anyway, because there is no tax penalty. So my guess is it seems pretty clear from today's argument that the Obamacare law will survive.
Pete, though, we won't know for sure till what, maybe the spring?
Yes, I mean, by the spring is when the court will decide the case. But, you know, if it's as sort of cut and dried as it did appear, maybe we'll get the decision earlier than that.
All right, Pete, thank you so much. Mike, let's talk about the campaign here. Throughout the campaign, Joe Biden talked about building on Obamacare. Now, this afternoon, as president-elect, he spoke about this. What did he say about the future of the ACA?
Well, Allison, I thought we saw a very interesting dynamic play out, not just from what the president-elect had to say, but the vice president-elect, Kamala Harris, who also spoke before Biden. She began by saying that every one of the votes for Joe Biden, and she reminded us that it was the most votes any presidential ticket has ever received, was a vote in favor of the Affordable Care Act and protecting it. Biden chose a slightly different approach, and he offered, of course, remarks about what's at stake for American families, but didn't put it in a campaign context. It's interesting because the Democrats have believed that, especially with 2 runoff elections in the state of Georgia, that this could be a galvanizing issue to help put 2 Senate candidates on the right footing. But let's take a listen to what Biden had to say about it.
Obamacare is a law that every American should be proud of. It's why people with pre-existing conditions are protected in this country. It's a law that delivers vital coverage, as I said before, for 20 million Americans who did not have coverage. It's a law that reduced prescription drug price costs for nearly 12 million seniors. It's a law that saved lives and spared countless families from financial ruin. So this effort to bypass the will of the American people, the verdict of the courts in the past, the judgments of Congress, in my view, is simply cruel and needlessly divisive.
Biden also said something he said often during the campaign, that he would protect Americans' health care like he protects that of his own family. And he said even if this were struck down, and the good news he heard from Pete, if he's watching, is it's unlikely perhaps to happen. But he said the Democratic Congress and the House and the makeup of the Senate being whatever it is, they're going to go to work to try to make sure that there is a healthcare system that protects Americans just like Obamacare did.
So, Mike, let's talk about the issues with the transition. The head of the General Services Administration, a Trump appointee, has not recognized Biden's victory. And now in a statement to NBC News, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence says it won't, quote, have contact with any transition team until notified by the GSA administrator. Sounds like we got a little problem here. Mike, you were the very first reporter to ask the president-elect about these issues at his press conference today. Let's talk about what's going on and how the Biden campaign is handling this.
Well, the Biden transition team has increasingly been sort of raising the temperature on this issue, eager, of course, to get access to the federal funding that should be available to them, access to the office space that should be available to them, and yes, access to the kind of classified briefings, both for their own staff and for the president-elect, the presidential daily brief that he needs to understand the threat environment. But if you watch the exchange that I had with the president-elect, you'll see that he, at least for now, is trying to sound like he's above the fray and not so concerned about it. Let's take a listen.
Thank you, Mr. President-elect. During the campaign, you said you were not naive about how difficult it would be to unite the country. It's now 3 days after you were projected as the president-elect. The president himself says he has won this election. His own administration has not moved forward to give you access to what you need to do to begin the work of your transition. Just a few minutes ago, the Secretary of State, when asked if he would cooperate with a smooth transition, he said there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. I wonder if you have a message for the president who may well be watching right now, and how do you expect to be able to work with Republicans when so many have thus far refused to even acknowledge your victory?
Well, first of all, we are already beginning the transition. We're well underway. And the ability for the administration in any way by failure to recognize this as our win does not change the dynamic at all in what we're able to do. We've announced yesterday, as you know, the health group we put together today. We're going to be moving along in a consistent manner, putting together our administration, the White House, and reviewing who we're going to pick for the cabinet positions. And nothing's going to stop that. And so I'm confident that the fact that they're not willing to acknowledge we won at this point is not of much consequence in our planning and what we're able to do between now and January 20th.
In response to Secretary Pompeo, and I also wonder, you warned during the campaign that as the walls closed in on the president, he would behave more erratically. Yesterday, he fired his defense secretary on Twitter. Are you worried that he's disabling the government? And what are you saying to the world leaders who are calling you at this point about the situation here?
Well, first of all, I'm letting them know that America is back. We're going to be back in the game. It's not American alone. Number one, I've had the opportunity to speak with now 6 world leaders, and the response has been very fulsome, energetic, and they're all looking forward to being able to, from Great Britain to France to Germany to Canada, et cetera, and Ireland. So I feel good about the ability to. I said when we announced that the next president is going to inherit a divided country and a world of disarray. The reception and welcome we've gotten around the world from our allies and our friends has been real. I'm having a number of other calls to return, and so I feel confident that we're going to be able to put America back in the place of respect that it had before.
So of the GSA issue, you heard Biden say there's not much consequence here in terms of his own planning. They're also, though, on the transition side, talking about the potential for legal action. And Allison, his campaign right now is holding a briefing to discuss what that might look like.
Mike, Emily, great questions today for the president-elect. No surprise there. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Allison.
Still no evidence of any significant voter fraud in the presidential election, but President Trump still won't concede. Our White House team reporting that people close to the president are concerned that he's spiraling into a rage, hurting his own legacy as well as the Republican Party. NBC News correspondent Carol Lee is one of the reporters on that story. Carol, what else are you hearing from your sources close to the president?
Well, also generally what we're hearing is just concern about how long the president is going to drag out what many of the people around him see as the inevitable, that he's lost this election. One advisor said to us, somebody needs to have a candid conversation with the president, and that it does not behoove him to stretch this out very much. There's hope, and I emphasize hope, that the president will wrap this up by this weekend, but the signs that are coming out of the president's Twitter feed and from his campaign suggest that that's not going to be the case. I mean, just a little while ago, his campaign was holding a conference call with reporters about his legal actions in Michigan, which is one of the earlier states that was called for President-elect Biden. So there's a lot of consternation about whether the president is and who can talk the president down from his position of being very dug in. And there are those around the president who think that he should just barrel ahead and continue to fight and not back down. We've heard from a number of the president's aides who say that and have conveyed that message really here in Washington and across these battleground states. But there seems to be a groundswell, at least, starting to form of concern within the White House among some of the president's outside advisors that he's potentially taking this too far and hurting his legacy and dragging the Republican Party down with him, Allison.
Carol, so far none of the Trump campaign lawsuits has gained any real traction, but here's what Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said today.
There will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration. All right, we're ready. They're watching what's taking place here. We're going to count all the votes. When the process is complete, there'll be electors selected. There's that process. The Constitution lays it out pretty clearly.
Carol, I've yet to speak to a legal expert who thinks that the outcome of this election will change because of these lawsuits. So what's going on here? What is the strategy? And is the White House divided on what they should be doing here?
Yeah, what you've heard from the Secretary of State really is just kind of him, and we should note that he is one of the president's staunchest supporters, and he's getting on board or on message with what the president has been trying to do here. He is somebody who, having run for office himself, knows how the math works. He also has ambitions for the 2024 presidential race. So that's all kind of hanging over what the Secretary of State said. But look, it's also always worth noting, I think, Allison, that at this point in the election, after the election in 2016, the math was the math. The media doesn't call this election. It's all about the math. And the president was fine with accepting those results then. And the Secretary of State also in his own elections knows that a winner is declared before the vote is fully certified. So what's going on here, according to one advisor that we spoke with, is there's this effort, the lawsuits, the public messaging to, quote, brand the president as anything other than a loser, that something that would allow him to save face and to basically back down and off ramp, so to speak, for him to take that would back away from his refusal to concede this election.
Carol, President Trump is still tweeting, but it's been, 5 days since we've seen him publicly. Yeah. Do we have any idea how much longer this will go on and when he plans to get back to his normal schedule?
No, I would note that tomorrow is Veterans Day. Yeah. So typically we would see the president on Veterans Day. So perhaps we'll get some visual of him, whether or not he speaks publicly. We don't know. But you're right. This is very unusual for this president. I mean, he's obviously very active on Twitter, but to go this long with no events on his public schedule, not even anything private, a lunch with a secretary in his cabinet or an intelligence briefing, is unusual, and we've been waiting to see when he will indeed speak publicly again. We just don't know.
Carol, let's talk about the coronavirus. The U.S. reported more than 133,000 cases yesterday. Vice President Pence leads the White House coronavirus task force, but he's heading to Florida on vacation. What do you know about that trip? And does he have any plans to meet with the task force, given the increasing seriousness of this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. What we were told is that the vice president was going to head down to Florida for a couple days of vacation. He was supposed to leave today, but then we got notice that the vice president is scheduled to give a speech on Friday, basically in Virginia, outlining this president's first term and all of its accomplishments and how, in their view, they have championed conservative causes. So one thing I will say that an advisor told us in terms of the president's legal strategy is when asked how effective they think this would be, they said, all you need to know is the vice president is going on vacation, Allison.
All right. The vice president is going on vacation. Carol, there it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Senate Republicans met with Vice President Pence today. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell saying he backs the president's legal challenges to the election results in key battleground states.
Well, what it says about America is that until the Electoral College votes, anyone who's running for office can exhaust concerns about counting in any court of appropriate jurisdiction. It's not unusual. It should not be alarming. I don't think anything that's occurred so far interrupts an ordinary process of moving through the various steps that I indicated.
NBC News correspondent Garrett Haig joining me now from Capitol Hill. Garrett, great to see you. We heard from McConnell there. What else are you hearing about the Republican strategy not to acknowledge the election results and how it benefits them potentially in the long run?
Yeah, Allison, a couple things going on here. I think what you heard from McConnell there might have been a little bit of that off-ramping that Carol was just talking about, trying to essentially buy time for the president to figure this out on his own and not have to throw him over the side. And I think that relates to the upcoming runoffs in Georgia. Remember, the presidential election is over. The elections that will determine the control of the Senate, that's a month and a half from now. That's those runoff elections in Georgia. And I think it's best to look at probably everything that Senate Republicans do in the intervening time as their efforts to make sure they hold on to those two seats and protect their Senate majority. They can't afford to alienate Trump voters. You know, the president may have lost, but he still controls that base of voters, and they can't afford to alienate them. So you see the majority leader there trying to play this very carefully.
Garrett, we mentioned Vice President Pence was on the Hill today. It was for a policy lunch with Senate Republicans. What else happened at that meeting? Do we know?
So I'm told he did give a brief update also on the state of the various lawsuits that the Trump campaign is engaged in all around the country to try to hold back these election results. And he also briefed Republicans on the state of the coronavirus response. I talked to a couple of Republican senators on their way out who told me that after hearing the briefing by the vice president, by the way, they concurred with the general feeling that the announcements about vaccines and some of the other coronavirus-related positive news didn't have any political dynamic, something that the president has been pushing on his tweets.
Garrett, Georgia is, of course, a state that could decide who controls the Senate. Here's Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer talking about Georgia's two Republican senators who called for the resignation of their Republican Secretary of State.
Two Republican members of this chamber have called on their own Secretary of State, a fellow Republican, to resign for no other apparent reason than the fact that President Trump did not win their state. They allege the Secretary of State did not deliver honest and transparent elections. That's really a stunning charge in the United States of America. That's the kind of thing you hear about in banana republics and dishonest elections.
Do Democrats see this, Garrett, as a potential advantage for their candidates? The two Republican senators may be wrapped up in the president's legal challenges while the Democratic candidates are out campaigning?
Well, look, the Democrats certainly have the clearer road here, right? They need to try to capture the same coalition that Joe Biden put together and try to drive up turnout among those voters in a special election that will be for control of the Senate. Republicans, at least until the president figures out what he's going to do, have a much tougher road to follow here. I mean, they've got to find a way to convince their voters to come out and vote in an election that the president's running around telling everyone it was rigged and stolen from them. Why would you come out and vote in an election that's rigged and stolen from them? So I think you see these Republican senators going after their own here. They're targeting this Republican Secretary of State to try to come up with some boogeyman, some way to look like they're still fighting, again, without alienating those Trump voters who they're going to need. This special election, all special elections are different and unique little snowflakes, and this one's going to be as unique as any and very, very weird, especially the longer the president holds on.
Garrett, we also heard some news that Vice President Pence will campaign in Georgia. He was supposed to be going on vacation in Florida first. What do you know about all this?
I don't know anything about the vacation part of it. This is a sort of a hard thing to keep track of. But again, you see the vice president here saying he wants to be helpful, wants to go down and campaign in Georgia. I'm sure those Republican senators would love to see the president campaign there as well. Look, I think what you're ultimately going to see in Georgia is if and when the president either concedes or it becomes clear that he cannot win there, cannot win the election, or has not won the election, you'll see the Republican messaging around Georgia change. And you'll see Republicans say, this is the bulwark against united Democratic control in Washington, D.C. And I suspect that's the kind of message that Mike Pence would be particularly good at giving after this. And then, oh, by the way, Allison, you got to start thinking about this if and when the president finally concedes. Somebody's got to be the Republican nominee to run for president in 4 years. Mike Pence could probably get a couple of nice little chips in his pocket from going down there and helping out some Republican senators who need it right now.
Garrett, I'm going to go ahead and say that our viewers do not appreciate talk of 2024 when we haven't settled 2020 yet, but all right, you went there. Look, everybody is. They're all talking about it already. That's the way the cycle goes, right?
You bet.
Thanks, Garrett.
See ya.
A top DOJ official resigning after Attorney General William Barr sent a memo to prosecutors giving them the green light to look into voter fraud claims. NBC News has obtained a copy of a memo that Richard Pilger, the director of the Election Crimes Branch, sent to his colleagues. In it, he says, having familiarized myself with the new policy and its ramifications, and in accord with the best tradition of the John C. Keeney Award for exceptional integrity and professionalism, I must regretfully resign from my role as director of the Election Crimes Branch. NBC News correspondent Ken Delanian joining me now. Ken, first let's talk about the significance of Barr giving prosecutors the okay to look into voter fraud allegations, and then the resignation here.
Sure, Allison. Well, normally the DOJ has very strict rules about not doing anything that could influence an election, not only before the election, which we sort of know a lot about, but after the election in the period before it's certified. And that's what's at issue here. This Barr memo essentially reversed that policy. Barr said, well, everybody's voted, so it's fine for you guys to start conducting investigations. But what some DOJ officials say is that actually this policy was designed to make sure that they don't interfere even with the certification, with the disputes, with the state lawsuits about the counts. They don't want a criminal investigation impinging on that. But what Barr is doing is allowing Republican-appointed U.S. attorneys around the country to initiate investigations, to take open steps, to send FBI agents to interview voters, to seize ballots, to do whatever they think is appropriate to investigate. Now, those investigations may not reach any fruition, but they will create a cloud, a further cloud, in the minds of people who already think that this election was stolen from Donald Trump. Millions of people may believe that. Trump is arguing that without evidence. That's the worry here, that Barr has really crossed the line in a way that helps Donald Trump politically, but may hurt the country.
So, Ken, what does this mean in terms of certifying election results? We know states need to do that. What kind of a delay could we see here? Could this push that back a bit?
Well, here's the thing. So the DOJ has said that they are looking into allegations of fraud in two states, Nevada and Pennsylvania. But the things they're looking at don't really add up to anything. They certainly aren't enough votes to influence the election. So it's really likely that not much is going to come out of this. They may poke around a little bit, and take a look at some fraud allegations, but it's not going to delay the certification of elections in any of these states, or it shouldn't. But what it has the potential to do is to convince already skeptical people who are following Donald Trump that there is fraud here, that where there's smoke, there must be fire, because the FBI is looking at it.
Ken, there seems to be a theme here. Everyone we're talking to is saying that these legal investigations, these will not likely amount to anything or change the outcome here. But here we are. Let's talk about some new reporting that you have about the Office of the Director of National Intelligence refusing to meet with the Biden transition team. What's going on there?
Well, what's going on is because the General Services Administration chief, the GSA, which sort of runs government real estate, hasn't certified that Joe Biden won the election. No government agency by law is allowed to deal with the Biden transition. And so the Office of Director of National Intelligence is saying, sorry, we can't give you any classified briefings. But it's more than that, Allison, because Biden is not getting the presidential daily brief, which has been given to every other winning presidential candidate in modern history the day after the election, except in 2000 when there was a long dispute about the election. And even then, George W. Bush, the Republican who ultimately won that race, got that briefing before the election was decided. So Donald Trump could, with a word, order that Joe Biden be given an intelligence briefing, but he hasn't done that. And Biden in the last hour at a news conference said, you know, hey, it would be nice to have this intelligence, but I don't need it right now because I'm not the president. But in reality, my sources say, national security sources, it's really dangerous for the president-elect to not be fully briefed on all the national security problems facing the country, because soon enough, he's going to be in office and he's going to be needing to make decisions about them else.
Yeah, it sounds like it's important information that he should have. Ken Delaney, and thanks so much for reporting today.
You bet. Thanks a lot.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
Remember that deep breath moment I spoke of on election eve? Maybe you could begin to let it out. No, this isn't over yet, but the votes are being counted. Not as fast as we want, but democracy is working. And we're proving once again that it is our voices that count.
White sandy beaches, crystal blue water. How incredible is that? We only get one shot at making the first impression. We're here to work, or you will be gone. High maintenance charter guest. This crew needs to step it up. New crew, perfect storm. This is not over. Get back to this boat now. Suck it up, trim up.
Set your DVR to watch new episodes of Problems Below Deck every Monday after 9.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
I didn't know, was my child dead? Was my child passed out?
I just kept saying, please be okay, please be okay.
You rush your child to the hospital.
A woman came in, normal clothes. We get down the hallway. She closes the door. They were accusing me of child abuse.
And that's when the real nightmare begins. Hey, calm down.
No, it's my children. I can't calm down.
Do No Harm, a new podcast series from NBC News and Wondery. First 2 episodes available Tuesday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
I wore my snowshoes. Hashtag blessed on that one.
I am a purebred Mormon. I'm Pentecostal. It is a very big deal that I'm no longer Mormon. I was raised Mormon, but I'm converting to Islam. Assalamu alaikum, bitches. Perfection is attainable. She's a bitch. Go away.
Amen. The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City premieres Wednesday at 10, only on Bravo. Set your DVR.
Hey, here's something I haven't said in a while. NBC News correspondent Simone Boyce is here with the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Simone, we had you doing stories and packages and all that kind of stuff, but I missed you in the headlines over election week. How you been? I missed
62, my friend. It is great to be back. We're going to jump right in and unfortunately start with some coronavirus news. The U.S. reported more than 133,000 new cases yesterday. That's according to NBC's latest number. Now, that is the sixth day in a row with new cases surpassing the 100,000 mark. Well, Palestine's leading peace negotiator, Saeed Erekat, has died at the age of 65. A hospital in Jerusalem says Erekat was in, quote, critical condition after testing positive for COVID-19 last month. And some news out of the Catholic Church here. A new Vatican report says Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II knew about sexual misconduct allegations against Cardinal Theodore McCarrick for several years. The U.S.-based cardinal was removed from ministry in 2018 following reports that he abused minors during the 1970s. And in some news that could potentially be good for the environment, Ford announced it will invest $100 million in their Kansas City plant to build a new all-electric van. The company plans to spend more than $11 billion on electric vehicles over the next couple of years. And for those of you who spent election week tracking Steve Kornacki at the big board, you were not alone. Jimmy Fallon decided to drop in on our data guru in his office, and here's what happened.
Hello, Cookman. What's up, dude? How you doing? Wow! Oh my! This is the office. What in the world? God! Over the second floor. Steve Kornacki, the legend, the chart drop himself. Come on out, buddy. Steve, are you still standing? You're doing all right. Charged. I'm feeling okay. Feeling great. You're awesome. What happens now, Chief? They put me back into preservation for about 3.5 years, and then yeah.
Allison, all of the Kornacki content online has been the best bright spot during this chaotic election cycle.
Simone, I love Steve Kornacki so much. He's my favorite person to run into in the newsroom. He's so terrific. And that office, like, you just give Steve a couple minutes and ask him about some of the things piled up of the sports memorabilia in there. And like, he just lights up. That was awesome. I'm sure Jimmy had a great time visiting him there.
Steve, enjoy preservation. We'll see you in a few years.
Yeah, Steve, we'll catch up with you soon once you've rested a bit. Thanks, Simone.
You got it.
The number of separated migrant children hitting a new high. Lawyers are now saying that they can't find the parents of 666 migrant children separated at the border. That is 121 more children than they reported to a federal judge last month. The lead ACLU attorney trying to reunite these families saying that it is taking a toll on the kids.
Kids that are even verbal enough, old enough to articulate it are telling us about how anxious they are. I mean, I just met with one teenager who was one of our first plaintiffs, who said every time he encounters anything new, his chest tightens up.
NBC News Justice correspondent Julia Ainsley and Jacob Soboroff broke this story. Julia is here with me now. All right, so Julia, last month lawyers said they couldn't find the parents of 545 children. Now it's 666. What happened?
Yeah, I know that's kind of a creepy, scary number, but that number is signifying more children and more parents than we knew of initially, because it's parents who weren't even able to be contacted. Basically, the ACLU, lawyers like Legal Alert, and others who are nonprofits who are taking on the task of finding these families because the U.S. government decided that it was too onerous for them to do. They were not given phone numbers or addresses or any contact information for this additional 120 some. So that is in addition to those 545 we talked about last month, where they had tried to make contact and couldn't reach out. They said maybe some of the information had changed. They begged the U.S. government to give more information, anything they could do to track down these families. And then they added on this extra piece. So we know about it because of an internal email that came from these lawyers to lawyers for the Trump administration and the Justice Department, where again they say, we need more information, we need your help. And Allison, I will say that we saw just a little bit of budging from administration lawyers after our last report on the 545, when they got to court in front of that judge who's overseeing the reunification process, just 2 days after our story and a day after the president and now president-elect were asked about that issue on stage. Lawyers then said, look, we're now here and ready to help. But people like Legal Learn are telling us it might be too little too late, because when they started separating these families in 2017, there was no process to keep track of them or to let them know where they could find their children.
Julia, the numbers are just overwhelming. Let's talk about how young these children are and what else you know about how they're doing.
Well, we understand about 20% are under 5. And so when Legal Learn talks about them not being verbal, I mean, you can imagine if you were separated in 2017 before you had a good memory of who your family, who your parent was, it can be really hard to verbalize kind of your feelings, let alone how to get back to them. And it reminded me of reporting we had done where we looked at this pilot program in 2017, where they said the lessons they learned there, these are the prosecutors who were responsible for prosecuting parents who have been separated. They said one of the lessons that should be put into place is not to separate a child too young to find their own way back to their family. They need to know their address, their phone number, all the things you would teach a young child when they're old enough to figure out how to get their way home. And that is because they didn't have a system. It had nothing to do with what was moral or anything. It was simply because they didn't have a system. They had to put this on the children. And as sad as that sounds, that they even had to talk about that guidance was ignored. They didn't implement that when they started the 2018 policies. We're talking about really young children. And right now, some of them could be in the foster system. Some of them could be living with relatives in the United States. But what makes it so hard is that a lot of their parents have been deported. And it's very hard for lawyers to try to get on the ground, find these parents, and let them know the rights they have to see their children again.
Julia, it's not just sad, it's frightening to think that they would be taking children away who have no way of getting back to their parents, don't know that kind of information. It's just so upsetting every time we check in with you about the latest here. The deputy director of the ACLU Immigrants' Right Project is concerned about the information provided to the ACLU. Here he is.
I mean, these are families that were separated in the beginning of the Trump administration. To the extent we got phone numbers, some of them were useful, most were not useful because the numbers are just stale at this point.
Julia, is there any clear indication the government even has this information available?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. In a lot of cases, they might not have the information available. So now let's look forward, right? It was a sad thing, and we look back on it, and we pick it apart, and we figure out who is responsible. But looking forward, we have a new administration coming in. So I've been talking to people in the incoming administration about what their plans might be, because we know that the president-elect, Joe Biden, has said on day one he wants to establish a task force to find these families. Well, because this information wasn't gathered early on, it could still be very difficult. But they want to move this responsibility, at least partially, onto the government. And they want to try things like a public service announcement, get onto the radio in Central America, explain to parents that they do have the option, they do have rights to come back and see their children and to try to reach as many as possible. So that's what we're looking toward next is it possible with this very limited amount of information for a new administration to come in, make this a priority, and see that these families are reunited?
Julia, it seems like this is going to be a difficult task. What have we heard from President-elect Joe Biden about how he plans to deal with this and tackle this? Because this certainly does not seem like something that is going to be resolved very quickly. This may be a problem that's on his hands.
Yeah, and one thing that they have not committed to yet, Allison, and I've been asking for the past 48 hours, as many people in the incoming, whether it be the transition to Biden or the campaign, have been asking as many people as I can, are you going to give these parents the options of coming to the United States to reunite with their children? In other words, will they have special protections where they're able to be flown here, see their children, and maybe apply for asylum, again, try to get a protection because of this very extraordinary and extreme thing that happened to them? And so far, we don't have a public commitment from the incoming administration. We know it's a tough task, and we'll be watching to see what they do next.
All right, Julia Ainsley, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The races in Georgia and Arizona still too close to call, and the election disputes are heating up. NBC News political reporter Vaughn Hilliard joining us now from Scottsdale. NBC News' Priscilla Thompson is in Atlanta. Priscilla, Georgia Senators Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue have called for the resignation of the Republican Secretary of State over election transparency. How's the Secretary responding, and what's the latest with the vote count there?
Yeah, Allison, they issued that statement saying that the Secretary of State has mismanaged this election and that it has been an embarrassment the way elections have been run here in Georgia over the course of the year. The Secretary of State responded with a statement fairly quickly there, with a very sharp response, denying those accusations and saying that he is focused on ensuring there is a fair and accurate count of the votes here in Georgia, and instead suggesting that Loeffler and Perdue focus on their upcoming runoff races and keeping the Senate in Republican control. So that was his suggestion to them. But we do know that a majority of the vote here is in. Joe Biden is leading by around 12,000 points, or 12,000 votes, excuse me. But it is still too close to call and likely headed towards a recount. Allison?
Priscilla, Republican Congressman Doug Collins, in charge of the ballot recount efforts, releasing a statement today saying they want a hand recount. What are officials saying? Because in Georgia, that recount would typically be done with scanners, right?
Exactly. It would be done in the same way that the initial count was done, which was these ballots were scanned and then tabulated. But earlier today, Doug Collins, who is leading that effort, came out and said that he wanted the recount to be done by hand. And for context, we're talking about nearly 5 million votes across the state that would need to be hand counted. And we just obtained a new letter that Collins and the Georgia Republican Party sent to the Secretary of State saying that before they even certify the results, so before there is even a recount, they would like to see the state recanvass these ballots by hand. And I want to read you part of that letter. It says, "We respectfully request prior to certification of the election results that your office exercise its statutory authority to order a manual hand recount of every ballot cast within the state of Georgia to ensure the integrity of the ballots and the election process." Now, the Secretary of State tells us, as it relates to this latest letter sent this afternoon, that they are reviewing those documents. But in terms of a possible hand recount, the Secretary of State tells us they would only do that if they were ordered to do so by a court. And Collins and the Trump campaign have signaled they are prepared to petition the court legally to have that recount be done by hand. Allison?
Priscilla, one last question for you. Ossoff kicked off a statewide tour. Where's he going, and are these areas where he's underperformed? Tell us about that.
Yeah, Allison, we're actually at his event right now. There's going to be a drive-in rally getting underway here in Atlanta in just a little while. But this tour is really focused on the Supreme Court case that is before the court right now related to the Affordable Care Act and wanting to talk about access to health care here in Georgia. So he's starting in Atlanta. He's also going to visit Macon, Savannah, and other places throughout the state. And these aren't Republican strongholds that he's visiting. These are places where that he won in the general election, but really seems to be looking to shore up more of that support and just re-energize these voters who are going to need to turn out again in just a few weeks to vote in these runoff elections in January.
All right, Priscilla, I'm going to leave you for a minute to jam to the great music there. Very good. While we head over to Vaughn, who's been patiently waiting. Vaughn, Arizona's still too close to call, but we see Biden leading there. What's the latest in the presidential race?
Exactly. The president's situation here is opposite of what it is over with Priscilla over in Georgia. He is down by about 14,500 votes here in Arizona. And this is a campaign that wants these votes continue to be processed, continue to be counted. Just about 7,000 more ballots were just dropped in the last few minutes out of Pima County. But the struggle point for this president is the fact that he won just over 50% of those ballots here. And so what you've seen over the last 2 days is him just slowly chip away that lead among these final ballots drops that are coming out here. And the question, though, is there any of these batches left in which he is able to actually make up this now 14,000 vote deficit? There's only about 20,000 definite ballots left to be tabulated in Arizona. There's about another 45,000 provisional ballots that may be verified, as well as early ballots where there were discrepancies with signatures that there's a Tuesday, or I guess today is Tuesday, Alice. There's a 5 p.m. deadline today for voters to go and verify their signatures or their identification when it comes to those ballots there. So we should know a lot more over the next 24 hours exactly how many ballots here in the state are left outstanding.
Vaughn, the Trump campaign has filed a lawsuit in Arizona. It specifically focuses on Maricopa County. What's the latest on that suit? What should we know here? And what are state officials who are the defendants in this case saying?
Exactly. Tomorrow's the holiday, so the first oral arguments in this case are actually going to be on Thursday, heard by the Maricopa County Superior Court here. The Trump campaign brought a suit forward, Allison, that says that at polling locations, there are some voters who have signed affidavits on behalf of the Trump campaign and the AZ GOP that when they turned in their ballot, the machine processing system alerted them to what we call an overvote. So on one of the particular races on the ballot, they maybe voted for two people when they were only allowed to vote for one person. And instead of giving that voter the chance to get a new ballot, they were encouraged just to push override. And I was just on the phone actually with the lawyer for these plaintiffs, for the plaintiffs in the case pushing back against the Trump campaign. In there, here in Maricopa County, were only 180 of those overvotes in Maricopa County, which is a lot fewer than that 14,000 deficit that this president has to overcome, even if the suit were to go in the Trump campaign's favor.
Thank you both so much. Always great to see you guys. Could Philadelphia Eagles fans take credit for putting Joe Biden in the White House? Affiliated suburbs came through for Biden in 2020. New York Times reporter Kenneth Vogel writing that they laid the final brick that rebuilt the proverbial blue wall. Ken, I'm married to an Eagles fan, so I understand how this works. But could you explain to our viewers what the 2018 Super Bowl win has to do with the 2020 election and Philadelphia souring on President Trump?
Well, first of all, Allison, I apologize that you have to put up with Eagles fandom. As a Eagles fanatic myself, I know how overbearing and aggressive it can be. And so you'll remember that in 2018, when the Eagles won their first Super Bowl championship, arguably the most glorious athletic accomplishment in the history of the city, it was right in the middle of the sort of President Trump's opposition or mounting opposition to the kneeling protest that many NFL players were engaged in to show their support for social justice and racial justice movements. President Trump opposed that, and as a result, many of the Eagles players and coaches said that they would not attend the traditional White House celebrations for the Super Bowl championship. President Trump, rather than having just a small group attend and potentially be embarrassed, rescinded the invitation. Philadelphia fans did not take kindly to that, and compounded, of course, by during this election campaign and the run-up to election day, when he was trying to lay the groundwork for his unsubstantiated claims of massive voter fraud, he said famously from the debate stage, he singled out Philadelphia as potentially a ground zero for this type of fraud and said, bad things happen in Philadelphia. So there was already this history of enmity between the president and Philadelphia when Philadelphia was thrust into the center of the election and the slow counting after election day that ended up with Philadelphia providing the pivotal votes that put Pennsylvania in Joe Biden's column and put Joe Biden over the top in the Electoral College vote count.
Look, Ken, I think it's a pretty simple argument, right? You just don't mess with Eagles fans. You learn that pretty quick. And I noticed your football back there. I just want you to know that we're aware of it. It didn't go unnoticed. On the flip side here, let's talk about President-elect Biden's long relationship with the city. I mean, this dates back to his days as a senator and how that helped him in 2020.
Yeah, that's right. For a time, President-elect Biden was known in the Senate as Pennsylvania's third senator. He's from the Wilmington area, 45 minutes southwest of Center City, Philadelphia. He had a lot of ties to the city. His wife is from Willow Grove in the north suburbs, has a very distinct Philadelphia accent. If you listen to her during the convention, you can make that out. His son Bo, his daughter Ashley graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. So he does have a lot of ties there. He based his campaign in Philadelphia. That was where the campaign headquarters were. Some of his earliest endorsements were there. So there was already this track record of ties to Philadelphia, and B, this acknowledgement that Philadelphia could very well be key to the 2020 election. And he came to Philadelphia many times during the campaign, not just for normal sort of daily operation of the campaign, gave some of his seminal speeches there, including his kickoff speech, including his sort of race relations speech in the wake of George Floyd's killing over the summer. So there was an affinity that was sort of being cultivated there. And so the combination of that with the enmity towards President Trump made Philadelphia's role in tipping the election towards Joe Biden something that a lot of Philadelphia Democrats, and the city is mostly Democrats, really sort of embraced and pound their chest over.
And look, we know so many of these things with elections just come down to food, right? Like, I'm a New Yorker and we judge our candidates based on how they eat their pizza. You eat it with a fork and a knife, you're going to have a big problem. Joe Biden knows you eat your cheesesteak bending over at the waist so you don't spill it on your khaki pants. I mean, that basically makes you from Philadelphia, right?
Yeah, we had an anecdote of the story about Bob Brady, the Philadelphia Democratic Party chair, longtime former congressman, teaching Joe Biden allegedly how to eat the cheesesteak like that with the lean. We didn't actually interview Joe Biden about it, but I'd be curious to see whether he's willing to give Bob Brady credit, or as a longtime sort of Philadelphia area denizen, whether he would say that he already knew that. But, the law enforcement actually to quiz him on his cheesesteak habits.
Look, these are my three questions. If he can corroborate that story, how he takes his cheesesteak, and where his favorite cheesesteak joint is. These are all very important issues that we'll have to dig into in the days ahead. You also contributed to another piece last night reporting that President Trump has started a PAC to help raise money after he leaves office. Now, President Trump still has not conceded the 2020 race. Is he really thinking about 2024 already? I think a lot of our viewers are just like facepalming. They're not ready to think about the next election when we still haven't wrapped up this one.
Well, folks around him definitely suggest that is on his mind, and that he might potentially file an exploratory committee. But what this leadership PAC is sort of an interim step. It allows him to raise money to continue to fund his political operation, political travels, and he's already raising money for this in the sort of under the umbrella of raising money for the recount. He's continuing to bombard his supporters with text messages and emails asking for money to fund his recount. Or his election challenge lawsuits, potentially recounts. But if you read the fine print on some of these solicitations, 60% of the funds that are being raised, up to $5,000 per person per year, are going to this new leadership PAC called Save America. He could also potentially transfer money, if there's any left from his campaign account, into this leadership account. It's not an uncommon thing for politicians to have a leadership PAC like this, to be able to set the stage for a potential run. What is uncommon is for a sitting president to have one while he is potentially on the way out the door and already talking about another run in 4 years. But in the Trump era, I think we've learned that some of these unprecedented things are not as surprising as they might otherwise be.
Ken Vogel, on behalf of my in-laws, our line producer, Christina Fiorentino, and on this, Zach Ertz's 30th birthday, go Birds.
Go Birds.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
I didn't know, was my child dead? Was my child passed out?
I just kept saying, please be okay, please be okay.
You rush your child to the hospital.
A woman came in, normal clothes. We get down the hallway. She closes the door. They were accusing me of child abuse.
And that's when the real nightmare begins. Hey, calm down.
No, it's my children. I can't calm down.
Do No Harm, a new podcast series from NBC News and Wondery. First 2 episodes available Tuesday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
I wore my snowshoes. Hashtag blessed on that one. I'm a purebred Mormon. I'm Pentecostal. It is a very big deal that I'm no longer Mormon. I was raised Mormon, but I'm converting to Islam. Assalamu alaikum, bitches. Perfection is attainable. She's a bitch. Go away.
Amen. The Real Housewives of Salt Lake City premieres Wednesday at 10, only on Bravo. Set your DVR.
For breaking news in our changing world, download the NBC News app.
Remember that deep breath moment I spoke of on election eve? Maybe you could begin to let it out. No, this isn't over yet, but the votes are being counted. Not as fast as we want, but democracy is working. We're proving once again that it is our voices that count.
The U.S. setting another daily record yesterday with more than 133,000 coronavirus cases, but there also is some good news. The FDA giving the okay to Eli Lilly's antibody treatment. Dr. Anand Parekh joins me now. He is the Chief Medical Advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Dr. Parekh, on top of the Eli Lilly okay, yesterday Pfizer said its COVID vaccine is more than 90% effective. Here's Dr. Fauci today talking about a potential vaccine timeline.
What will happen is that we end of November, the beginning of December, if that goes through, and again, I don't want to get ahead of the FDA, they're going to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, but I believe with the impressive nature of the data, that should go through smoothly, that by the time we get into December, we'll be able to have doses available for people who are judged to be at the highest priority to get it first.
Would you take it?
Well, I'm going to look at the data, but I trust Pfizer. I trust the FDA. These are colleagues of mine for decades, the career scientists. If they look at this data and they say this data is solid, let's go ahead and approve it. I promise you, Andrea, I will take the vaccine. And I will recommend that my family take the vaccine.
All right, Dr. Fauci seems pretty confident there in this Pfizer vaccine, but let me ask you a few questions. Who falls into that highest priority category that he mentioned? And then when could a vaccine be available for the rest of the folks here in the U.S.?
Sure, Allison. There's a committee called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices that advises the CDC. And preliminarily, the highest risk or priority groups are healthcare workers, essential critical infrastructure workers, those over the age of 65, as well as those at highest risk for severe complications. So those are the priority groups. Of course, there's not going to be enough vaccine initially, even for those high priority groups. So I think the American public, this is good news, but the American public is going to have to continue to be patient. You know, distribution of the vaccine is really a 2021 proposition.
Dr. Park, as we mentioned, the FDA granted emergency authorization to Eli Lilly's experimental COVID-19 antibody treatment. That's a mouthful there. This is similar to the one President Trump received. Tell us more about this treatment. Who would get it?
This is more good news, Allison. So this is particularly a treatment for individuals, who are at high risk for severe complications, who, if they receive this particular drug early on, so right after they're positive, the preliminary data shows that they have a reduced chance of hospitalization as well as developing severe complications. I think the catch here is initially there are only 300,000 doses, so it's going to be pretty limited. But FDA has granted emergency use authorization, and this is one area where we just didn't have a pharmaceutical or a therapeutic, and this is the first one that really gets at people right after they're positive to really reduce the progression of illness.
All right, it's been a tough couple of days in terms of coronavirus cases, but glad to hear at least we have some good news in terms of treatments and vaccines. Dr. Park, always great to have you with us.
Thank you, Allison. Take care.
You too. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy announcing new COVID-19 restrictions. The state reporting 9,500 new cases since last Thursday. Jersey hasn't seen numbers like that since May. Starting Thursday, bars and restaurants in the state will have to wrap up their indoor service by 10 p.m. each night, and bar-side seating will stop altogether. NBC News correspondent Antonia Hilton is in Morristown with more.
Hey, Allison. So I'm in Morristown, New Jersey, and just yesterday around 1 p.m., Governor Murphy announced a new set of restrictions that primarily target the food service and hospitality industry. And this is coming on the heels of a big uptick in cases in the state, and we're now at a statewide death toll of about 16,440 people. So the governor felt compelled to act before things potentially got worse going into the holidays. So this is what the restrictions look like. From 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., there will be no more indoor dining, only outdoor, and there will be no more bar seating available to people at any time of the day. In addition to all of that, there will be no more indoor interstate sports. But the main group here that's concerned about these changes It's the owners of bars, diners, lounges that cater to late night audiences. Just like this late night diner that's right behind me, it's owned by a man named Peter Rostidis. He's owned it for over 2 decades, and he's nervous about what this next round of restrictions could mean.
You really can't prepare. I wasn't expecting it, and now we have to close our indoors at 10 p.m. And we used to be a 24-hour diner. Now we stay up until 3 a.m. From 10 to 3 a.m., we lose the young people, the people that work late, the hospital people. So there is an impact on our business. People like to go out. It's a very trendy town. So we will lose. We will lose, definitely.
So to put some of what Peter's describing in national perspective, the National Restaurant Association estimates that about 15% of eating and drinking establishments have closed during the pandemic. And Peter tells me he estimates that he's going to take a hit with these new restrictions of about 10 to 15%. And keep in mind, that's on top of what he estimates to be about a 30% hit that he's already been dealing with throughout this pandemic. Back to you, Allison.
Hey everyone, I'm Allison Mars. You're watching NBC News Now. We've got several big stories for you this hour. First, the future of Obamacare. The Supreme Court seems likely to uphold the Affordable Care Act, hearing 2 hours of oral arguments today after Republican-led states challenged the ACA over the individual mandate. President-elect Joe Biden talked today about the importance of Obamacare and a smooth transition to the Oval Office. Meanwhile, the current White House is slowing that process down. President Trump refusing to concede. The head of the General Services Administration, a Trump appointee, refusing to grant the incoming administration access to classified documents like the president's daily briefing. In the meantime, the coronavirus pandemic reaching new highs. 133,000 new cases reported in the United States yesterday. That's a first. And Dr. Anthony Fauci says that this can still get worse.
Whenever you have a respiratory-borne illness and you enter into the cooler months of the fall and the soon-to-be colder months of the winter, you do more things indoors as opposed to outdoors. And that's just another added ingredient to the risk you have with a respiratory infection. So we're going to have to address that.
Let's start today with an update from the Trump and Biden teams. NBC News correspondent Carol Lee's got the latest on the Trump administration. NBC News correspondent Mike Memoli is covering the president-elect in Wilmington, Delaware. Mike, Joe Biden talking today about the Supreme Court battle over the Affordable Care Act. What did he say?
Well, Allison, as somebody who watched the Obama-Biden dynamic very closely for 8 years in their administration today, the first thing that struck me was our first glimpse at what a Biden-Harris dynamic was going to look like. Because before Biden addressed the Affordable Care Act case today before the court, we heard from the vice president-elect, and she put this in a little bit of a political context, saying that as Biden and her got the most votes for any ticket in presidential history, in their view, every vote for them was a vote for the Affordable Care Act. Now, for Biden, the policy ramifications for him are significant if the ACA were to be thrown out. Having to start from scratch potentially in his administration would be a big wrench in his legislative agenda. But for now, at least in his remarks today, he was focused about less what was at stake for him and more what's at stake for the American people. Let's take a listen.
Let's be absolutely clear about what's at stake. The consequences of the Trump administration's argument are not academic or an abstraction. For many Americans, they are a matter of life and death in a literal sense.
Now, the timing of all this is important because, as you know, Allison, there are 2 Senate special elections runoffs in just a few weeks. And for the Biden campaign that always felt that the Affordable Care Act and the pre-existing conditions was a winning issue at the ballot box, for the Biden team now to be putting a focus on it is sending a message, especially to Georgians, that this could be something that's also on the line for those 2 Senate elections in a few weeks.
Carol, it's been a week since Election Day. You're reporting on the mood within the White House as Trump still refuses to concede. What are your sources telling you? What is the mood on Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, what we're hearing, Allison, is that there's increasing concern among people who are around the president, who are inside the White House, outside advisors, at the campaign, about his mood, that he's increasingly angry. There was described to us as concern that he's in a rage spiral or spiraling into rage, that he's not giving up on this fight that, frankly, a number of people who we spoke to who work for the president said that isn't going anywhere, and they know it. We spoke to one advisor who said that the president someone needs to have a candid conversation with the president, and that the longer he drags this out, the worse it is for him. There's concern that he's going to be dragging down his legacy, which some of the people who work for the president are very proud of his accomplishments, what they see as his accomplishments. There's concern there. There's concern he's going to take down the Republican Party with him, and also just where this ends. That's a real open question right now, Allison.
Carol, today's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was asked if President Trump's refusal to concede discredits U.S. efforts to promote democracy abroad. He called that question ridiculous. What are you hearing, though, about when and if the president will actually concede?
Well, what we heard for the hope is from some of the individuals we spoke with is that this would end this weekend. Now, that's a hope. That doesn't necessarily mean that the president's actually going to end this weekend. But that's where some of the people who are closest to him would really like it to go. The problem that they have is who is going to tell the president to put an end to this. And as you've seen, you mentioned Mike Pompeo. We've seen Mike Pompeo's comments are fueling what the president is doing here. You've heard comments from a number of Republicans, most Republicans on the Hill, who are not acknowledging President-elect Biden. And so and then you hear from the people who are very close to the president on the campaign who are still going out and championing these lawsuits. So some of it depends, I think, on when these lawsuits actually wind up running their course. And then obviously almost all of it depends on the president and when he decides to do that. And while there are people around him who hope that's this weekend, it's not clear at all that that's what he's prepared to do.
Mike, delaying the transfer of power isn't just an inconvenience. It could be a potential national security threat. Let's talk about the issues the president-elect could face here and what he's planning to do about this.
Yeah, Allison, because when we were initially having this conversation about what it meant that the GSA was not issuing this letter of ascertainment that Biden was the president-elect, the focus initially was about things like office space. They can't get in to the space that's been made available. We can't get access to money. The Biden transition teams can't begin having conversations with the Trump administration officials, the career agency officials, to learn about what needs to be done. But today, a lot of Democrats are raising this as a national security issue, saying that with the president-elect, as we now understand, not being given access to the presidential daily brief, his own staff not being able to have the kind of classified briefings that they would typically begin getting at this point, it creates a situation that the 9/11 Commission warned about 20 years ago when they said the fact that there was this delayed transition because of Bush versus Gore potentially left the new administration without the full understanding of security threats. Now, it was interesting that the president-elect, when he was asked about this at his news conference today, downplayed this, said there's one president at a time, even if he did have access to classified information now that he doesn't already have, that it would not be something he could act on. But clearly there's almost like a good cop, bad cop routine, because Democrats on Capitol Hill, and even Marco Rubio today, saying that he should be getting some access to this information now as a national security issue.
Mike, the president of Mexico has said that he will not congratulate Joe Biden until, quote, all legal issues are resolved. How does Joe Biden plan to work around this? Or how does he think, or does he think, rather, this will be resolved when the election results are certified?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is sort of the exception so far. A number of other foreign leaders have already been able to speak with the president-elect. We know he's spoken with the British Prime Minister, the French President, the German Chancellor, as well as the Canadian Prime Minister over the last several days. Interestingly, because of this GSA issue, typically the State Department would facilitate these calls. That's not happening. But I had a chance to ask the president-elect what his message to these world leaders is as he talks to them. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I also wonder, you warned during the campaign that as the walls closed in on the president, he would behave more erratically. Yesterday, he fired his defense secretary on Twitter. Are you worried that he's disabling the government? And what are you saying to the world leaders who are calling you at this point about the situation here?
Well, first of all, I'm letting them know that America is back. We're going to be back in the game. It's not America alone. Number one, I've had the opportunity to speak with now 6 world leaders, and the response has been very fulsome, energetic, and they're all looking forward to being able to, from from Great Britain to France to Germany to Canada, et cetera, and Ireland. So I feel good about the ability to. I said when we announced that the next president is going to inherit a divided country and a world in disarray. The reception and welcome we've gotten around the world from our allies and our friends has been real. I'm having a number of other calls to return, and so I feel confident that we're going to be able to put America back in the place of respect that it had before.
Now, Allison, we've talked about what we heard from the Biden transition last night, the possibility of legal action about this GSA issue ongoing. Biden downplayed that himself this afternoon. And just in the last few minutes, the Biden transition held another briefing where they also sort of backed away from that threat somewhat, saying ultimately they're confident that they'll get access to the information and security briefings that they're entitled to.
Carol, a question for you. What can you tell us about Vice President Mike Pence's schedule? He was expected to go to Florida for vacation. Now he's heading to Georgia. Do you know what the latest is there?
Yeah, we're expecting the vice president to vacation for a couple of days in Florida. And interestingly, one of the president's advisors said to us when we were asking them whether they thought that these legal challenges to the election results in different states would be effective. They said, all you need to know is that the vice president is going on vacation. So that was their way of summing up that they don't think these are going to be very effective. And the vice president, we know, is going to Georgia in coming days, but he's also scheduled to give a speech on Friday in Virginia, basically outlining the administration's accomplishments over the past 4 years. So he's still remaining relatively visible, but it's also noteworthy that the vice president has not been as strident in backing what the president is doing in terms of saying there was widespread fraud in the election. He's certainly an ally, and he's in line with the president on this, but not in the very vocal sort of way that we've seen from some of the other allies of the president. And we know that Vice President Pence has ambitions for 2024, so all of that is in play right now.
All right, Mike and Carol, thank you both so much. Before I let you go, though, I just have to say, Mike, I realize it is to be expected that you might have been the first reporter to ask questions today, given how long you have covered the now president-elect. But I just wanted you to know our newsroom cheered when you were the first one to stand up and ask questions and did such a terrific job at it as well. So just a little Mike Memley love for everybody today.
Thank you, Elsa. I appreciate that.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
The Supreme Court heard arguments today that could determine the future of the Affordable Care Act. 18 Republican-led states are challenging the law, arguing that Obamacare's individual mandate is unconstitutional. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams joins me now. Pete, the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act in 2012, though this court looks a lot different now. Conservatives hold a 6-3 majority. Let's talk about what happened today.
I don't think that's going to make a difference. It does appear that the Supreme Court is prepared to spare Obamacare. There are basically three questions raised by these states. The first is, do they have standing? Did they suffer some problem from Obamacare that gives them a right to sue? I'm not sure what the answer to that is. The second one deals with the individual mandate. So remember, when the law was originally passed 8 years ago, it said all Americans have to buy insurance or pay a penalty on their taxes. And the argument was, well, this is unconstitutional. Congress can't make you go out and buy something. But the Supreme Court said, well, it's just a choice. You either buy insurance or you pay a penalty, so it's a legitimate use of Congress's taxing authority. Then in 2017, Congress said, okay, we'll just set the tax at 0. Now you can't say the law is saved by the tax, and so therefore the mandate is unconstitutional. So that's the second question. Is the mandate unconstitutional? And again, I'm not sure what the Supreme Court will say about that today. I'm not sure there are 5 votes to say it's unconstitutional. But the key question is this one. The red states say, and the the Trump administration say, okay, because it's unconstitutional, the entire law has to fail, because when it was passed, it was all considered to be an interlocking whole. You couldn't have coverage for pre-existing conditions. You couldn't say parents can keep their kids on until they're in their 20s, unless everybody goes out and buys insurance and has enough money in the system. I think the Supreme Court is prepared to say that if the mandate is unconstitutional, it could be removed, leaving the rest of the law intact. It seemed quite clear that there are at least 5 justices on the court who hold that view, the court's 3 more liberal members, and Chief Justice John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh has perhaps been the most outspoken of the justices in saying that when the court looks to whether laws can be struck down, if parts of them are infirm, it should always try to save the law whenever possible. And Chief Justice Roberts said today, the best intent of what Congress wanted us to do is in 2017. They zeroed out the tax, but they left the rest of the law alone, which he said is a pretty strong sign that they wanted the law to remain intact. So based on all that, I think even if the Supreme Court says, yes, the states can sue, yes, the mandate is unconstitutional, they're going to leave the rest of the law intact. And by the way, saying the mandate is unconstitutional changes essentially nothing, because when Congress zeroed out the tax, it left the mandate completely toothless. So the mandate really doesn't do anything now. There is no command to buy insurance, so nothing really would change.
Pete, a lot of Americans have been wondering what Justice Amy Coney Barrett might do once she was sworn in and as part of the Supreme Court. Anything notable from her today?
Not really. I mean, she asked questions of both sides, good, interesting questions, that tended to be rather technical about some of the state's claims. It wasn't really possible to sense how she would vote. But in any event, I think there was a feeling in Congress, and certainly during her confirmation hearings, that her presence on the court was going to be the deciding vote on Obamacare. And I think that today's argument shows that's not the case. There are at least 5 votes, and maybe more, to say that the law should survive.
Pete, we should get a final word on this by the spring?
Yes. I mean, it's possible the ruling could come out before then.
Okay.
But these technical rulings on the big cases tend to take a long time.
Pete Williams, thank you so much.
Okay.
The Office of the Director of National Intelligence says it won't meet with the Biden transition team until the General Services Administration formally recognizes Biden as president-elect. NBC News correspondent Ken Delanian joining us now. Ken, what is the GSA saying about why they're holding up the letter to begin this transfer of power to the Biden team?
Nothing very convincing, Allison.
Okay.
They're simply saying that they haven't made the legal decision yet, which is, as far as we can tell, unprecedented in the history of this language, which is not all that old in the statute of the Presidential Transition Act, this notion that the GSA has to proclaim a winner before there's cooperation. But in every other presidential election in modern history that we can find, the transition started immediately, like day one. The only exception, obviously, was in the 2000 election, which was hotly contested for many weeks in Florida. But so the result of this is that the Biden team is not getting intelligence briefings. They're not getting classified information. They don't have access to funds. They don't have the State Department to help them make calls to foreign leaders and take congratulatory calls. So there's a whole mechanism that should be in place now that isn't. You know, if this lasts for a couple of days, it may not be a big deal. But if it starts to go a week, 2 weeks, it becomes a huge problem, and potentially for national security. You have people who need to take these important jobs who aren't getting the information they need to know what's going on in the world, what the threats are facing in the United States. I mean, let's recall George W. Bush, it was cited that the delay in him getting classified briefings may have contributed to their inattentiveness to the threat that al-Qaeda posed before the 9/11 attack. So, you know, that's the kind of seriousness with which people are viewing this, Alice.
Yeah, Ken, I mean, that is a serious potential national security threat to not get a presidential daily briefing leading up when you've got to jump in January and take the reins right away.
Yeah, that's right. And look, Joe Biden was the vice president, so he got these briefings for 8 years. So it's not like there's a security risk. Right. And leaving aside this statute, this language in the statute, Donald Trump could, at this very hour, give the order and allow Joe Biden to get these briefings. It's his classified information. He's the president. He can give it to anybody he wants. But he just hasn't done that as part in keeping with his stance that, you know, he won the election and there's fraud. And so that's where we stand. And Joe Biden, in his comments today, you know, tried to sort of hew a moderate tone. He said, look, I'd like to have this classified information, but it's not necessary for me right now. I'm not the one making decisions. That's true for now. But as we get closer to the swearing on January 20th, it's going to become more of a problem.
Yeah, and as you said, President Trump could easily do that. It doesn't look like he is going to. Ken, I want to turn to the DOJ and their election crimes chief resigning after AG Bill Barr sent a memo to prosecutors giving them the green light to look into voter fraud. How unusual is this, or is it unusual for an AG to get involved in an election?
Well, what's unusual is that Barr overturned years of DOJ precedent which said that they should not take open, overt investigative steps even after an election until the election is official, until it's certified, because they don't want to influence the process. They don't want the news of a criminal investigation to influence state officials as they count the votes and certify the election. So Barr has blown that out of the water. He's given Republican-appointed U.S. attorneys permission to go poking around and looking into allegations of voter fraud. The thing is, there really aren't any substantive allegations that we have seen of criminal voter fraud around the country. There's a few anecdotes here and there. So this may not amount to much, but the worry is that it's going to further fuel the misinformation, the disinformation, really, the notion that there was massive fraud in this election, which Donald Trump keeps saying and which millions of people seem to believe, Allison.
Ken, could an inquiry from a DOJ prosecutor impact states certifying votes here? I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying that we might not have a delay or an issue here, but I think people are wondering what legal actions, what issues that we're looking at might actually change the outcome of this election.
I mean, it would have to be a massive fraud to impact any of these states. You know, I mean, an unheard of in the history of America kind of fraud, and it's really it's really unimaginable that any kind of federal investigation would impact the certification. Now, the Trump team has gone to court in Pennsylvania, and they're trying to get an injunction to hold up the certification, but not many legal scholars think they're going to succeed, Allison. Frankly.
All right, Ken Delaney, thanks a million.
You bet. Thanks.
The presidential race in Arizona. Sent a letter to Georgia's Secretary of State this afternoon asking for a hand recount. Have we gotten a response yet from the Secretary of State?
That they are still reviewing those documents, reviewing that letter to look at sort of the claims that are being made in it. But the Secretary of State's office has said all along that they are investigating any claims of voter fraud, but in order to do that, they need reliable claims of that. And in that letter that Representative Collins sent, they claim that they are getting tens of thousands of these types of concerns flooding into the Trump campaign and into their offices. But the real thing here is the evidence of that, the specific examples of that. We saw the Trump campaign file a suit last week in regards to voter fraud issues, and a court ultimately dismissed that. So it'll remain to see whether or not that letter and these claims have any standing. But as far as we know from the Secretary of State's office and just what we know in general, there's just no evidence of widespread voter fraud in this election or any elections for that matter, Allison.
Priscilla, Collins isn't the only one going after the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, they're having a pretty rough day, my goodness. Senators Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue want the Secretary of State to resign over election transparency issues. What can you tell us there?
Yeah, the Secretary of State is definitely facing a lot of heat this week. Those senators